Building a hardware synth setup doesn't have to be complicated. Here on the table, I have laid out everything you need to build a hardware, dawless synth setup. And in today's video, we're going to go over each step in the process. I'm going to talk about the different things you need, how to hook it up, and how to make music with it. And this tutorial was made in collaboration with Thomann for their Keys and Frequencies synth event. And big thank you to the sponsors of this event for making it happen. First, let me touch on something that needs to be said. You have probably seen these huge and impressive synth setups online, on Instagram, YouTube, on my channel, for example. But it needs to be said that impressive doesn't mean better. It might look cool, but the more stuff you add to your hardware synth setup, the more complicated it gets. And I think that one of the key reasons why a hardware synth setup is so much fun is its simplicity. So don't overcomplicate things. You can get a lot done with a main sequencer and 1, 2, maybe 3, 4 external synths connected to that sequencer. So what do we have here? And I'm gonna treat it a bit like you don't have any pre-existing knowledge. So if you're coming into this and you don't know anything about synths, hopefully I can break it down for you. So this here is the Novation circuit tracks, and it is what you call a groove box. It basically means that you can make a full track on it. You have 2 synth tracks, so you can have a bass and a lead sound, for example, and you have 4 sample tracks that can do drums or vocal samples or whatever you want to load into it. You can't sample directly into it, you load samples into it. And this is a great starting point. It's a great standalone groove box that you can just pick up and use. It's also portable, got a built-in battery. There's a lot to like here. But for this video, we're using it because it has 2 sequencer tracks in addition to the other tracks. So what are sequencer tracks? Well, in the world of hardware synthesizers and hardware music production setups, basically sequencers are these devices that you can use to control other synths, like this synth here, for example. So this is the Korg Minilogue. It's an analog synthesizer. You can play chords on it. It's polyphonic. And you can use a sequencer to control the Korg Minilogue, which is kind of where you start out if you want to build a hardware synth setup. You need a sequencer. So the circuit is our main sequencer, but it's also a synth, it's also a sample player. And you can make full tracks just using it. Now we're adding on here the Korg Minilogue analog synth, polyphonic, like I said, and it basically lets you play chords. You can do all manner of sounds with it. It's nice because it has a lot of hands-on control. That's something you want in a hardware synth setup. And we're going to connect these 2 together using a Midi cable. So it looks like this. And I, of course, picked a really long one. You can buy them at the lengths you actually need. But basically, you just take this Midi cable here, connect it to one of the 2 outputs on the circuit tracks, and connect it to the input of the Korg Minilogue. Oh, and on the circuit tracks, it has a Midi output and a Midi through port. We won't get into what a through port is, but basically you can set it up so that the through port is a second output. Outputs meaning that they send MIDI data from the sequencer to an external synth. So now we can send MIDI notes from this sequencer here to the Minilogue. But we also need to connect audio. Now, there would be two different ways of doing this. So firstly, you could just send audio using the audio output on these two synthesizers out to an external mixer, like for example, the Bluebox here from Kenton Music, and record them individually. Or if you want to, you could send the audio from the Minilogue into the Novation circuit tracks and apply effects, so reverb and delay inside of the circuit tracks. And that's what we're gonna do for today's video. So just take a normal audio cable. I think you should really try and get the TRS cables, the balanced ones. I think that's the way you say it in English. And you just go here and you locate the output of the Minilogue. It's a mono output. And you insert it into one of the inputs here of the circuit tracks. Now we can send audio from the Minilogue to the circuit or through the circuit's effects. But we're not done yet. The circuit has two sequencer tracks and we're going to take full advantage of that. So one of the tracks we use to control the Minilogue and the second track we're going to use to control the Volca NuBass. The Volca NuBass is interesting because it's an analog bass synthesizer, and I think that having these analog synths together with more digital circuit makes a lot of sense. So we take the Korg Volca here, take another Midi cable, so you need two of them, hook up into the input, and we hook it up to the second output of the circuit tracks. Now here we encounter a possible problem because, as you can see, the Volca here uses a headphones output here. So these big ones won't work, but don't worry. We can use a cable like this from mini jack to big jack. I don't actually know the English word for it. And then we take this cable here, put it into the second input of the circuit tracks. And now we're pretty much set up to use them together. Now, if you want to be a little bit more advanced, what you could do is you could actually use the MIDI output of the Minilogue here and hook it up to the input of the circuit tracks, letting you play the circuit tracks from the Minilogue. Now, that could be something you want to do or not. So it's a little bit more advanced, but yeah. Next up, we need to decide how to record this entire setup. Now, you could either take the individual outputs of all of these devices and input it into your audio interface or external recorder, like this one. You could also take your two external synths here, mono out from both, into the Novation circuit tracks, and then stereo out from the circuit tracks into your audio interface, mixer, recorder, whatever solution you got. For this setup, we're sticking with the whole dawless idea, and dawless means basically that we don't use a computer. So here I have stereo mini jack to two left and right big jacks, and we're just gonna go left output here, right output. We're just gonna go into the input number 1 here on Kenton Music Bluebox. This is a little mixer and recorder. You also have some internal effects on it. It's really, really nice if you want to build a hardware synth setup. Totally recommend it. But however, don't get, you look at this one here. It's a thick boy. This one here. It's very thick. You do have to get something thinner than this because it won't fit. So that's a mistake I did. Don't make that mistake. And now we have a sequencer that can also play its own internal synth sounds and samples. We have a polyphonic analog synthesizer. We have a bass synthesizer. Let's see what it sounds like. Now, making music with this setup is very simple. Turn on the circuit tracks, make sure that MIDI 1 and MIDI 2 are sending to the right MIDI channels. So hit Shift, Setup, MIDI 1, and here we can see that MIDI 1 is sending to MIDI channel number 1. MIDI 2 is sending to MIDI channel number 4. This one is set to 4, this one is set to number 1. So if we go in here, MIDI 1, What you're hearing there is the bass here, the new bass. MIDI track 2, playing the Korg Minilogue. Now in order to add some effects, hit Effects, select a reverb, MIDI 2, and maybe a delay, and increase it for MIDI 2, and then we go to Note. And as you can see, the Minilogue really benefits from the added effects. Let's start with a little drum groove, drum number 1 here, put down some kicks, and I'm thinking I'm gonna do something a bit slower here, so I turn down the BPM here. Let's do a bass line. We go to Patterns, and we chain 2 patterns together for the bass. Hit record. I'm just gonna let it cycle. And let's chain 4 patterns together for MIDI number 2, which is controlling the Minilogue. Let's add some more drums. This is just a very simple, straightforward way of making electronic music, not using a computer. And I think it's a lot of fun. You should definitely test it out. Now there are different types of sequencers that you can use. This one here is kind of what I call like a mid-tier thing. It's like a groove box, so you can make full tracks on it, but it's also a sequencer. We talk just sequencers to start with. I think that there are some excellent sequencers that you can pick up. For example, the KeyStep Pro from Arturia. So this one doesn't make any sounds. It has sequencer tracks that you can use to send MIDI notes to external synths, for example, or using it with your computer. So this is just a standard MIDI controller and sequencer. It doesn't make any sounds. Now, in the same category, and I'm gonna try to pick stuff up here without like breaking the studio. In the same category, we actually have the Korg SQ64. So this one here is also a very interesting little sequencer, much smaller than the KeyStep Pro. This one can also control Eurorack using CV, send MIDI to external synths. It's just a very nice little sequencer. If we go up one level, you get to kind of the Groovebox, the more, well, inexpensive or slightly more expensive Groovebox stages. And these devices can produce sound. You have, for example, on the circuit tracks, you have a sample player, and on the Digitact here from Electron, you have a sampler, so you can actually sample sounds. This one has a synth engine, this one does not. So this is the Digitact. This one has 8 tracks, and the circuit tracks has, well, basically 4 polyphonic sequencer tracks that you can use. So 8 tracks that you can use to control external synths, and this one has 2 dedicated tracks for controlling external synths and 2 for controlling the internal synthesizers. But you can use those to control external synths as well. It also has 4
sample playback tracks, whereas the Digitact has 8 tracks that you can use for samples. Mono samples on both of them, but the circuit can't sample. So that's pretty much it. And the top tier of brains for your hardware synth setups is something like the Machina Plus, the MPC Live, for example. And these are fully fledged workstations. So the difference here, if we compare it to these other two, scooch over. If we compare it to these devices here, a big difference is that on these devices we have a very limited track count, 8, 4, and on something like the MPC-1 or Machina Plus, we have not indefinite, but there's just so many more tracks that you can use to control external equipment. You have stereo sampling, you have sample playback, you have a lot more. So this is more your workstation, but it works really well as a brain. Digitone is also a really good example. The Digitone is like the synth brother or synth sister to the Digitact. It's a lovely little sequencer and FM synth. It has 4 MIDI tracks and 4 synth tracks. So that one works as well as a brain for a hardware synth setup. Deluge is also a really good, I don't have it here, I have it in another room, but I have it. It's actually a really good brain as well. It has also, it doesn't have the limitations of, say, the circuit and the Digitact, for example. So it's a much more feature-packed device, more complicated to learn, but also more rewarding in the long run, I think. So that's, I'd say that the Deluge is up there together with the Machina Plus, as well as the MPC-1 and MC Live. And then you also have the MC707. While it doesn't really sport the sort of MIDI track functionality that many of the other sequencer here sports, it's also usable to sequence external gear. Track count is a bit more limited, while the price tag is still pretty hefty. I think it's around $1,000. But it's a really good groove box as well, sounds really good. So you have to ask yourself, do I want something that can sample? Do I want something with internal sounds? Or do I just want a pure sequencer or MIDI controller to start with? So that's kind of where you have to start figuring it out. If you are using a sequencer that doesn't have multiple MIDI outputs, what you need is something like this Kenton. Kenton and I think Thomann sells them. They're really practical, small boxes. This is the Thru-5. So the Thru-5 is a MIDI splitter. Basically, you just hook it up to the output. Let me see here. The output here. Hard to read when everything's upside down. The output. And it sends MIDI to 5 other outputs. So it splits one output into 5 outputs, and you can connect it to 5 synths, set those synths to MIDI channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, in order to control them. So you could basically have 8 synths connected to the Digitact, because it has 8 MIDI channels, MIDI tracks, that can send MIDI data on 8 individual MIDI channels. So that's also super practical, a really fun way to set stuff up. So if you want to send MIDI from circuit tracks to 4 synthesizers instead of 2, you will need a MIDI splitter that splits one of the outputs, and then you can hook up multiple.
And I think that one of the reasons why hardware synth setup is so much fun is because you get a lot of expression out of it. So unpredictability, expression, vibes. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons. That's also a reason to keep it kind of small. Don't go overboard if you're a beginner. So I really recommend circuit tracks as a starting point for your hardware synth setup. Now, what do I recommend to pair with it? Well, the Minilogue could be a good option. It really benefits from the internal effects of the circuit tracks. So that's an option. You want something polyphonic at least. one polyphonic synth because it takes advantage of the polyphonic sequencer, basically a sequencer that lets you sequence chords. So you can send chords to an external synth. But a bass synth, like this one here, can't do chords, of course. But a bass synth is also a really good option because an analog bass synth like the NuBass here really complements the circuit tracks super well because it just adds this kind of gritty flavor to it. So yeah. So thank you so much for watching today's video. If you have any questions, if something's confusing, just drop a comment down below. And if I can't answer, maybe somebody from the community can. Thank you also to Tommen and their Keys and Frequencies event. If you haven't checked out the event, I'll link it down below. There's a ton of cool stuff that happened during the event. You should go and check it out. Thank you also to the sponsors of the event, especially Novation and Korg. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day. Talk to you later.